At 6 in the morning, I woke to the sound of my front door shuddering under the violent rhythm of a sledgehammer. The whole frame rattled as if someone were trying to tear the house off its foundation. Then came Nora's voice, sharp, vicious, and far too awake for Dawn, screaming my name like she had every right in the world to be there. "Elliot, open this door. We're getting in one way or another." Another blow slammed into the door, sending dust from the hinges drifting to the floor. Through the wood, I heard Jacob breathing hard the way he used to when he played football in high school. Except this time, he wasn't chasing a ball. He was chasing access to the home where his mother and I built our life together. I pictured him standing there, fists clenched around the handle of that sledgehammer jaw, tight eyes avoiding mine even through the barrier between us. "Elliot, don't make this harder," Nora shrieked. "You can open it now, or you can open it when the police are forced to intervene." I stood on the other side of the door, surprisingly calm. The kind of calm a man reaches only when something breaks inside him, long before the moment of crisis. I could feel my pulse steady, my breathing slow, and a strange clarity settle into my bones. Nora believed she had me cornered. She believed she could force her way into this house because in her mind, it already belonged to her. But she didn't know everything. Another violent crash. Jacob grunted with the effort, and Nora barked, "Harder. Just break it, Jacob. He can't stop us." The entire house trembled. Then a voice behind me, quiet, low, steady, cut through the chaos, as if the storm outside had suddenly stilled. "Leave it. I'll handle this." I didn't turn right away. Even though the voice was behind me, its presence filled the whole room with an authority I hadn't felt since Vivian was alive. Only when Nora screamed again did I finally look back. He stood in the hallway like a man carved out of stillness, broad-shouldered calm, composed the kind of calm that comes from years of knowing exactly what danger looks like. He nodded once at me, and without another word, I reached for the locks. Nora shouted triumphantly when she heard the clicking metal, convinced her intimidation had worked. But when I opened the door, she froze mid-breath. Her face drained of color. Jacob's hands slackened. The sledgehammer dipped toward the porch floor. What is he doing here?" she whispered. The morning began to unfold in the strangest way, as if the world had split at the hinges, just like my doorframe threatened to. But the truth was, this confrontation didn't start at dawn with a hammer. It began 7 days earlier with a series of quiet shifts, so subtle I almost missed them. That week had carried a charge in the air, the kind I used to sense before a forest storm, when the smell of pine sharpened and the lake stilled unnaturally. I'd been sitting in my armchair reading old notes from Vivian's fieldwork when the doorbell rang unexpectedly. I wasn't expecting anyone. Most people gave me a call first out of courtesy or habit. But Nora and Jacob walked in like they always did, uninvited, but pretending it was natural. "Dad, we were just in the area," Jacob said, wearing that tight, tired smile that never reached his eyes. He used to greet me with warmth. Now everything about him felt coached. Nora stepped in behind him, scanning everything with the eyes of someone appraising an estate rather than visiting a home. Her gaze wandered across the mantel bookshelves, framed photos, and even the small bowl where I dropped my keys. I'd seen that look before in real estate agents and lawyers, never in a daughter-in-law. "You've done well keeping up this place," she said sweetly, though her smile stiffened around the edges. "But it must be overwhelming now. Have you thought about what happens to the property down the line? You know." Legally, there it was, the real reason for her visit. "I'm managing," I said. "Oh, I know you are." She touched a photo of Vivian on the shelf, her fingers lingering a moment too long. "I just think it's important to keep paperwork updated. Wills, insurance, property transfers, lots of families lose assets because they weren't handled properly." Jacob shifted uneasily. The last time we talked about wills was after Vivian's funeral. He hadn't brought it up again since. Nora continued pacing through the house, pretending to study the artwork, but clearly looking for something more. She paused in the hallway outside Vivian's old study. The door was closed as it usually was. I rarely went inside. Grief makes certain rooms heavier than others. You still keep all of Vivian's documents? She asked casually. Sometimes families build scrapbooks, memory collections, things like that. I nodded but didn't answer further. Something about the question nudged unease into my stomach. They stayed less than an hour. When they left, Jacob hugged me awkwardly, like he wasn't sure if he should. Nora didn't hug me. She offered a smile that never touched her eyes and said, "Take care of yourself, Elliot. We're here if you need assistance." Assistance. A word coated in honey and poison. That night, the unease sharpened. I found a window slightly cracked open in the hallway, one I knew I had locked that morning. And the old blueprints of the lakeside house, the ones Vivian and I drew together decades ago, were moved an inch to the left inside the desk drawer. I have been an engineer all my life. I remember the position of things down to the millimeter. There was no chance I had left them like that. Before I could talk myself out of worry, I found something else. The next morning, a plain white envelope slid under my door. No name, no markings, just one typed sentence inside. Don't trust anyone asking about Vivian's papers. My hands shook. Not out of fear yet, but out of recognition. Someone else knew what Nora had begun digging for. I shoved the note into my pocket as a soft knock came from the back door. Grace, my neighbor of nearly 15 years, stood on the porch with her usual loaf of warm bread. She had the same gentle eyes Vivian admired so much, eyes that missed nothing. "I saw Jacob and Nora yesterday," she said. "They seemed focused." I shrugged, not ready to share anything. But Grace sighed softly and added, "Vivian once told me she worried about someone in the family pushing too hard on certain things. She asked me to keep an eye on you, Elliot. Just in case. In case of what I asked." Grace hesitated, then shook her head. "You'll know when the time comes." Her words settled into me like a stone in deep water. That evening, Jacob called. His voice sounded strained. "Dad, Nora thinks maybe you shouldn't live alone anymore. Maybe we can help with paperwork, reduce your stress, handle things. The same phrase she'd used earlier. Coached, scripted. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house felt like a whisper of something shifting. Every shadow reminded me the world was changing around me before I could catch up. But the worst moment came when I stepped into Vivian's study for the first time in months. The air felt disturbed somehow. The faint scent of Nora's perfume lingered in the room. And the framed landscape painting Vivian loved hung crooked on the wall, something she never allowed. Behind it, a faint chalk mark, a symbol Vivian once used in her notes to indicate "look here again" later. My chest tightened. Someone had touched what they shouldn't. Someone was searching, and Vivian knew long before I did that one day I'd have to defend what she left behind. I didn't yet understand what Nora wanted. But I understood one thing that night as the lake shimmered outside the window and the house settled into uneasy silence. Something was coming. Something that would turn dawn into a battleground and force me to open my door to a man my wife trusted more than her own family. Jacob called just after 7 that morning, his voice weighed down by hesitation, the kind I recognized from his childhood when he'd broken something and didn't know how to tell me. Now, though, the thing breaking wasn't a lamp or a baseball trophy. It was trust mine, his maybe both. "Dad, do you have a minute?" he asked. "I always have a minute," I said, though my stomach tightened. His voice sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. "Nora and I. We think it might be good if you stayed with us for a while. Just until we can get the house evaluated, maybe get some help in place." "Help for what?" Well, for you. The house is old. It's a lot to manage. And you've seemed overwhelmed lately." I stared at the lake through my kitchen window, the water calm and bright, reflecting everything clearly except the things I needed answers for. "Overwhelmed," I repeated. "It's not an insult," he said too quickly. "Just something to consider. We're worried." There it was again, worried. "Help. safe, words meant to soothe but sharpened into tools. Your mother and I managed this house for 30 years, I said softly. I haven't forgotten how. Jacob exhaled defeated. Dad, please think about it. I didn't promise anything. I thanked him for calling, hung up, and let the silence settle around me like falling dust. The call wasn't about my well-being. It was about positioning, preparing the story, setting the stage. I had seen this tactic used in engineering negotiations, softening the resistance first, then applying pressure once the surface cracked. The problem was, I wasn't cracked yet. Later that afternoon, I visited the storage loft above the garage, a place I hadn't touched since Vivian died. I needed air, space, something familiar to remind me who I was before people started treating me like a man unraveling. Dust floated through shafts of afternoon light as I pushed open the door. The air smelled of pine wood old paint and Vivian's lavender sachets. She'd tucked them everywhere, insisting they helped preserve wood. Boxes were stacked neatly labeled in her handwriting. Blueprints, Vivian's field notes, Mercer family photos. I stood for a moment with my hand on the box marked field notes, remembering the way she used to lean over the dining table scribbling ideas long past midnight. I knelt by the nearest shelf and found something else, a small wooden chest with a brass clasp. I didn't remember bringing it here, and Vivian certainly never mentioned it. I opened it slowly. Inside lay a single item, a ring, plain silver, worn at the edges. Not mine. Not Vivian's. It was too large for her hand and too small for mine. Underneath it, folded twice, was a scrap of paper with her handwriting on it. Do not let this leave the house. Nothing more. No explanation, no signature, just that warning. I held the ring up to the light, turning it between my fingers. There were faint initials etched inside the band, CW. I didn't know anyone with those initials. Not from our family, not from her colleagues, not from our early life together. Why did she keep it secret? And why did she hide it in a loft she knew I rarely entered? I slipped the ring back into the chest, closed the clasp, and sat on the floor, the weight of unanswered questions pressing into my spine. That was when I heard footsteps outside the loft door. Slow, careful, testing the floorboards. At first I thought it might be Grace, perhaps coming to check on me. But the steps paused, retreated a bit, and then a whispered voice drifted under the crack of the door. He's up there. Look again later. He has to have something hidden. Nora's voice. A moment later, Jacob answered, sounding conflicted. We shouldn't be sneaking around. This isn't right. It wouldn't be necessary if he would just cooperate. Nora snapped. We need to know what's going on before he does something impulsive. We're doing him a favor. My throat tightened. An old familiar ache, the sensation of betrayal, settling deep enough to bruise. The footsteps retreated. The house door closed a minute later, but the echo of their words stayed long after they were gone. They were searching my house. Whether they were looking for Vivian's documents, her research, or something else entirely, I couldn't yet tell. But they were looking. I remained in the loft until dusk, trying to make sense of the puzzle forming piece by piece. Nora's questions, the shifted blueprints, the strange envelope, the ring with initials I didn't recognize, and Vivian's warning from beyond the grave. By the time I descended the stairs, the house felt different, like the air pressure had changed. I walked to the back porch and found Grace watering her plants, humming softly the way she always did. She looked up when she saw me, and her face softened. You look troubled, Elliot. I hesitated. Have you noticed Nora or Jacob around today? Oh yes, she said, setting down her watering can. Nora came by while you were out walking this morning. She didn't realize I saw her. She walked around the side of your house, lingered by the study window. Strange behavior, if you ask me. Did she do anything else? Grace crossed her arms, considering. She took a call and said something about not much time, and he's hiding it somewhere. She seemed upset. Or angry. Hard to tell with her. I felt a cold bead of dread slide down my spine. and Elliot Grace added quietly this morning, a car I didn't recognize was parked across the road for nearly an hour. A dark sedan. The driver never got out. You think it's connected? She nodded. Vivian warned me once, you know. She said if anything happened to her, there were layers to her work. Layers that might draw the wrong kind of interest. What interest? Grace lowered her voice. She didn't say. Only that some of the things she'd discovered belonged to people who would do anything to bury them. I stared out toward the lake, its calm surface betraying nothing. When I returned inside, the house felt even less like mine, and more like a battlefield waiting to erupt. That night, Jacob called again. His voice trembled not with fear, but with guilt. Dad, did we see you earlier? Through the loft window, yes, I said. A long silence stretched. We're not doing anything wrong, he said finally, but the conviction in his voice was thin. We're just trying to help. Nora said if something serious happens and we didn't act, we'd regret it. There's nothing serious happening, I said, except what the two of you are creating. He sighed, defeated. Dad, maybe you don't see it, but you've been stressed. Distracted, forgetful. I haven't forgotten anything, I said sharply. I know. His voice softened. I don't want to lose you like we lost Mom. Pain flared deep in my chest, a raw, unspoken wound. You're not losing me, I whispered. But he didn't believe me. I could hear it in the silence that followed. When the call ended, I stood in the foyer for a long time, listening to the house breathe. Vivian once said, old houses remember things, that if you're quiet enough, they'll tell you what's coming. That night, they whispered warnings in every creak and shifting board. Before bed, I double-checked every lock. I closed every window. I placed the wooden chest with the ring in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. And then, as I passed Vivian's study, I noticed something new, something chilling. The chalk mark behind the crooked painting had been erased. Someone had been inside the room again, not looking, knowing. That was when fear finally found me, not for myself, but for the fragile line between truth and danger that Vivian had left for me to uncover. I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. Somewhere in the house, under floorboards, or behind walls, or sealed inside memories, only Vivian understood was the reason Nora was pushing Jacob. The reason strangers were parking outside. The reason I received warnings from an invisible ally. And I was running out of time to figure it out before someone else did. I didn't yet know that this danger had a name, but I was about to learn it very soon. I woke before sunrise, the kind of early waking that happens when your mind senses something your body hasn't caught up with yet. The house felt unsettled, not noisy, not disturbed, just waiting. Vivian used to say the air in this place shifted whenever something important was on the horizon. This morning it felt almost electric. I made coffee and stepped out onto the back porch, the cool air biting gently at my skin. The lake was still perfectly smooth, like a mirror held up to the dimming night. I stood there with the mug warming my hands, trying to anchor myself to something solid. Anything. That was when I noticed the boot print. Just one. Pressed faintly in the dew-darkened wood of the porch. Not mine. Too large to be Grace's, too heavy to be from a casual visitor. The tread was distinctive military style or tactical. Not the kind of shoe Nora would wear, and not Jacob's either. He wore running shoes everywhere, even to dinner. I crouched and touched the imprint. It was fresh, hours old at most. My pulse quickened, not in panic, but in recognition. Someone had been here during the night. Someone who wasn't afraid of being close to the house. Someone patient enough to watch from the dark. The cold sip of coffee tasted suddenly metallic. I stood slowly and scanned the tree line across the lawn. Nothing moved. Nothing watched back. But the feeling lingered, a sense of eyes that had just recently withdrawn. I heard gravel crunch from the front yard. Grace's footsteps were light, but after living beside her for nearly 2 decades, I could recognize the sound of her approach anywhere. She appeared around the side of the house, carrying her morning basket of herbs. "You're up early?" she said gently, though her gaze sharpened as she studied my face. Grace saw too much. Always had. Couldn't sleep, I murmured. Something felt off. She followed my eyes toward the print on the porch, her lips pressed together. "That wasn't here yesterday." "No," I said. "It wasn't." Grace set her basket on the railing and stepped closer, examining the print with the same thoroughness I expected from an investigator, not a retired librarian. "This is the same style my cousin used to wear. He served in the Marines. Tactical boots. Could be a hiker," I offered, though we both knew how unlikely that was. "No hiker comes this close to a house at night," she said. "Not unless they're looking for something." Her words echoed Vivian's old warnings, the ones I'd dismissed as overcautions from her research years. "But now, there's something you should know," Elliot Grace said quietly. "And I've tried to stay out of your affairs because it wasn't my place. But you need the truth." I stiffened, heart tightening with the fear that all these subtle shifts were converging into something much larger than I'd imagined. Grace folded her hands. "In the weeks before Vivian died, she asked me to keep a record of unusual activity around your home. She'd noticed people watching cars slowing down, unfamiliar footprints near the property." She looked up at me, eyes soft with memory. She told me there were things she had discovered, things she didn't want falling into the wrong hands. I swallowed hard, the cold morning suddenly feeling too thin. Why didn't she tell me any of this? She wanted to, but Vivian believed she needed more proof before she brought you into it. Grace reached for my arm. "She wasn't hiding anything from you, Elliot. She was protecting you." The words both soothed and stung. Vivian, always thinking 2 steps ahead, had shouldered a weight she must have known I'd eventually carry. "Grace," I said quietly, "what kind of things are we talking about?" She hesitated. She didn't tell me the specifics, only that she had collected documents over years of fieldwork records tied to a man she once knew, a powerful one. Someone with enough influence to erase things he didn't want found. The world narrowed. A man she once knew. I thought of the initials carved into that silver ring, CW. Before I could ask more, Grace turned her head sharply toward the road. A car rolled slowly past the front of my property, a dark sedan, windows tinted so deeply I couldn't see inside. It moved at a crawl, as if the driver were inspecting each inch of my land. "That's the same car from yesterday," Grace whispered. "I'm sure of it." The sedan paused at the end of my driveway. For a heartbeat, the engine idled. Then it drove off, accelerating only after it rounded the bend and disappeared behind the trees. Grace's voice trembled slightly. "You need to be careful. Someone is watching." I nodded, not trusting my voice. After she left, I walked the perimeter of the property, on instinct, the engineer in me cataloging details automatically. Fresh scuff marks near the shed. A bent blade of grass, too heavy to have been shaped by wind. Someone had walked the path behind the house recently, close enough to look through the windows. Somewhere in this place, these walls, these rooms, was something people wanted. Something Vivian hid so well that even I didn't know what it truly was. I stepped inside and locked the back door. Then, driven by a sudden urgency I couldn't explain, I went straight to the study. Vivian's study had always been sacred ground for me. A sanctuary of her thoughts, her research, her voice. I opened the door slowly, half expecting a confrontation with a ghost of memory. The room was exactly as she left it, her shelves organized with military precision, her desk covered in neatly stacked notebooks, her reading glasses still resting beside an unfinished draft she'd been writing the week before she died. But something was wrong. The rug beneath the desk was slightly off-center. Only an inch, maybe 2, but I noticed. Vivian never left anything misaligned. Ever. I dropped to my knees and lifted the rug corner. Underneath it, the wooden floorboards showed the faintest sign of disturbance, a thin line of dust pushed aside. Someone had lifted the rug. Recently. My pulse thudded as I searched for the cause. A loose board, a hidden compartment I tapped lightly on each plank. Most responded with the solid thump of nailed wood. But one gave a hollow sound. I pressed my thumb to the edge. The board shifted. I lifted it, breath held. Beneath it lay a small sealed envelope, the kind Vivian used for personal notes, not research. My name was written on the front. I recognized her handwriting instantly. The letter trembled in my hands. It took longer than it should have to break the seal. Inside a single page. Elliot, if you found this, I need you to listen carefully. Some things have been set in motion that you must finish for me. Please trust only those who have earned it, and never let them take what is hidden here. It is the key to everything. Then at the bottom, a postscript that chilled me to the bone. He will come back for it. And he will not come alone. No signature, no explanation, just a warning. I folded the letter and sat back on my heels, eyes scanning the study with a new understanding. Vivian had been preparing for this, preparing me for this, and whatever key she meant wasn't the envelope itself. The hollow beneath the floorboard was empty. Someone had already taken what she hid there. My phone rang suddenly, jarring the silence. Jacob's name lit the screen. I hesitated, then answered. Dad. His voice cracked. We need to talk. What is it? It's Nora, he said, sounding defeated. She's talking to someone. A man. Says he's someone important. Someone who knows things about Mom. My breath caught. What's his name? I don't know, Jacob whispered. But Nora called him by his initials. C.W. The room tilted. The ring. The man. The letter. The car. The boots. A name I hadn't heard yet, but one Vivian clearly feared. Dad, Jacob said, nearly whispering. Nora said he's coming here. Soon. I closed my eyes, feeling the pressure of Vivian's unseen hand guiding me. The storm had been building for years, and now it was finally at my door. Jacob arrived just after 9 that morning, his car pulling up the gravel drive far too fast, spitting dust into the air behind him. I heard the engine cut the slam of his door and the hurried footsteps racing toward my porch. When he appeared in the doorway, he looked nothing like the confident young man who'd once carried his mother's smile. He looked shaken, haunted even. Dad, he said, breathless. I need to come inside. I stepped aside without a word. He entered quickly, glancing behind him as though expecting someone to emerge from the trees. When the door shut, he let out a long, unsteady breath and ran both hands through his hair. You weren't followed, were you? I asked. I don't think so. I studied him carefully. He wasn't lying. He was terrified. Sit, I said softly. Tell me what's going on. We moved into the living room. Jacob sat on the edge of the armchair closest to the window, bouncing his foot anxiously. His eyes darted around the room as if hunting for danger. It's Nora, he began. She's been making calls. A lot of calls. And yesterday I overheard something I wasn't supposed to. What did you hear? Jacob swallowed. She was talking to a man. She said his name was... Well, she didn't say his full name, just Mr. Wynne. Or sometimes C.W., and she said he needed an update. He met my eyes. Dad, she told him that I was starting to ask questions. That you were acting suspicious. That she might need to escalate. A cold current slid down my spine. Escalate how I asked. She didn't say. But she sounded scared, angry too. Jacob rubbed the back of his neck. Then she told him she'd make sure you came to the house for dinner tonight so he could evaluate the situation himself. I leaned back slowly. So that was the next step. An invitation wrapped as hospitality with a trap sitting underneath. Dad. Jacob said, voice cracking, Who is he? Why is Nora talking to someone like that? Why does he know anything about our family? I opened my mouth, but no explanation came easily. The name Calder Wynne hovered between us like smoke. Even saying it aloud felt dangerous without more information. Instead, I asked, "Did Nora threaten you directly?" He looked away. That was answer enough. She said if I didn't stop questioning her, I might lose everything. Dad, I don't even know what that means. I did. It meant control, power, manipulation tools used by people who didn't mind burning relationships to secure leverage. Jacob, I said carefully, I need you to tell me the truth. Are you helping her look for something inside this house? His face crumpled, guilt spilling into every line. At first I didn't realize what she was doing, he whispered. She said we were just checking to make sure you hadn't misplaced anything important, that it was about protecting you. But when she started going through Mom's study, I knew something was wrong. I nodded slowly, grateful for the honesty, even if it came too late. What exactly is she looking for? I don't know, he said. But she thinks Mom hid something here. Something valuable. She kept saying it was ours, that she was entitled to it now that she's part of the family. A flicker of anger rose inside me, protective sharp. This house is not hers, I said quietly. Jacob nodded. I know that. But she won't stop. She gets more determined every day. He hesitated. Dad, she said something else, something that scared me. What? She said, he'll be here soon. And once he sees the condition Elliot is in, we'll have everything we need. The implication hit me hard. Guardianship, control, signing rights, removal from my own home. All the subtle checks she'd been making about memory routine confusion weren't concern. They were ammunition. The room went heavy and silent. The only sound was Jacob's breathing, uneven, shame-filled. I'm sorry, he whispered. I should have told you sooner. I didn't know what she was planning. I didn't want to believe it. I know, I said. And I did. Jacob wasn't cruel. He wasn't calculating. He was lost, blinded by guilt and a marriage he no longer understood. Before I could say more, a soft knock came at the back door. Jacob jumped. Did you invite someone? No, I said, standing. The knock came again, 3 steady taps. I approached cautiously, looked through the side window, and felt my chest loosen just a fraction. It was Grace. I let her in. She stepped inside with a concerned expression, her shawl draped around her shoulders, like armor. Elliot, I saw a car pull up briefly at your driveway entrance. I think it was the same sedan from yesterday. Jacob stiffened. Grace glanced at him, offering a polite nod. Jacob? Hi, Grace, he murmured. She turned back to me. I know this may not be the right time, but you need to see something. She held out a small notebook, thin worn, the edges curled. My breath caught. It was Vivian's handwriting on the cover. Where did you get that? I asked. Voice unsteady. Vivian gave it to me years ago, Grace said. She told me to hold on to it until a day came when you needed it more than she could predict. My heart pounded as I took the notebook in both hands. The weight of it seemed disproportionate, too heavy for its size, like it carried more than paper inside. I opened to the first page. If you are reading this, Elliot, then the wrong people are circling, and you must understand the truth before they tell it to you twisted. My throat tightened. Jacob leaned closer, eyes scanning the page. The next lines were even more startling. The man you must watch for is named Calder Wynne. Do not underestimate him. He has resources, connections, and a talent for convincing others he is helping them. He is not. He destroys what he touches. Jacob's face drained of color. Grace spoke softly. I don't know all the details, but Vivian feared this man enough to prepare all of this before she died. My hands shook as I turned the page. Calder will come for what he thinks belongs to him. He believes he has claim to it. He believes he has claim to you. He believes he has claim to our son. I froze. Jacob stared at me, eyes widening. Wait. What does that mean? I didn't answer. I couldn't not yet. Because the next paragraph was a dagger. When I met Calder years ago before you and I married, I did not know what he truly was. I didn't know what he was capable of. By the time I learned, it was too late to erase the past. But I built a life with you because you were everything he wasn't. And you must know that. Jacob whispered, Mom knew him. Grace touched my arm. Elliot, there's more. I turned another page. If Calder has resurfaced, then he has either lost something valuable or he has realized what I hid from him. And what I left for you will expose everything. A chill slid through me. Exposure. Evidence. Something powerful enough that a man like Calder Wynne would watch my house whisper to my daughter-in-law and send a sedan to park outside my driveway in the dead of night. I think Nora's working with him, Jacob said quietly, dread pooling in his voice. Grace nodded gravely. She is. And she doesn't know who she's dealing with. I closed the notebook slowly. Vivian had spent her final years preparing for a war she knew I'd inherit. She knew I wouldn't be ready. She knew I'd try to trust the wrong people. So she left breadcrumbs, warnings, protection. Jacob stared at me with shaken uncertainty. Dad, what are we going to do? I exhaled the weight of responsibility settling into my bones, heavier than grief, heavier than fear. We're going to find what your mother hid, I said. We're going to understand why Calder wants it. And then I met his eyes, letting him see the resolve rising in me slow and sharp. We're going to protect this house, her legacy, and each other. Because whatever storm Vivian expected, whatever shadow Calder Wynne cast, it was already here. And I was done being unprepared. The house felt heavier after Jacob and Grace left, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of Vivian's warnings. I stood alone in the living room, with her notebook still in my hands, tracing the edges of the pages like they were fragile pieces of her voice. Outside, the lake shimmered beneath a pale sky, deceptively calm, giving no sign that my world had begun tilting in ways I could no longer ignore. I needed answers, real ones, not the fragments left scattered in hidden floorboards and hurried warnings. And I knew there was only one person who might have them, Roman Hale. Vivian had mentioned him only a handful of times, always in passing, always with a strange tension beneath her voice. He's someone I used to work with, she'd say, never elaborating. Someone who understands things most people don't. Back then, I didn't ask questions. Now, I wished I had. I sat at my desk, pulled out my old phone book, and found the number she'd scribbled years ago. Roman Hale, do not call unless necessary. Today qualified. When he answered, his voice was low, gravelly, and instantly alert. Who's this? This is Elliot Mercer. A long pause, too long. Vivian's husband, he said at last. His tone softened just slightly. I wondered when you might need me. She left your number? I said. She didn't tell me why. She wouldn't, he replied. Vivian knew the danger of knowing too much too soon. A beat. What happened? I told him. Nora's sudden interest in my home, the forged concern, the mysterious sedan, the footprint on the porch, Grace's warnings, and finally Calder Wynne's name appearing like a specter from Vivian's past. When I finished, Roman was silent again. Then I'll be at your place in 2 hours. Don't talk to anyone until I arrive. Roman, He hung up. I wasn't sure what to expect, but 2 hours later, right on time, a black SUV pulled up the driveway. The man who stepped out looked like someone who lived between shadows, salt and pepper hair cropped close military posture, eyes sharp enough to slice through lies without effort. He approached the porch with the steady confidence of someone who knew exactly how many threats were hiding in the tree line behind him. Elliot, he said, shaking my hand firmly. Let's get inside. Once the door closed, he scanned the house with clinical efficiency, checking each window, each hallway, each potential entry point. It wasn't paranoia. It was training. Your wife trusted me, he said. So before I ask anything, I need you to understand something. What's that? If Calder Wynne is involved, you are in far more danger than you realize. I swallowed hard and nodded. Tell me everything. Roman sat across from me, elbows on his knees. Vivian and I crossed paths years ago while she was doing investigative fieldwork for a research consultancy. Calder was one of the names that kept surfacing quietly, subtly wrapped in corporate layers to keep his hands clean. What was he involved in? I asked. Roman exhaled slowly. White-collar crime, mostly. But the organized kind. Offshore accounts, asset laundering, shell companies tied to political campaigns. Nothing that could be pinned directly on him. He paused. Except one thing. My pulse thudded. What thing? Vivian found something, Roman said. Something that could rip the mask off his entire empire. She started keeping records, names, dates, transactions, connections. And she hid them so well no one ever found them. Until now, I murmured. Roman nodded. Calder must suspect that whatever she collected is still inside this house. And that's why Nora is digging around? I asked. His mouth tightened. Nora is a pawn. Calder uses people who think they're important. He makes promises he never intends to keep, manipulates them, plays them. He likely told her there's an inheritance or asset she deserves. Something rightfully hers. She believes she's helping her family. She's helping Calder, I said bitterly. Roman didn't argue. So what exactly is he looking for? I asked. That, Roman said, is what we need to figure out. He motioned for me to bring him any documents Vivian left behind. I retrieved her notebook, the envelope from the floorboard, and the wooden chest with the ring. Roman opened the chest, picked up the silver ring, and scrutinized the initials. CW, he muttered. This belonged to Calder. My breath caught. Vivian kept it hidden. She kept it to remind herself who she was up against, he said. This isn't a ring you gift or lose casually. Calder gave this to her when he believed he owned her. I stiffened. Owned, Roman nodded grimly. Vivian met Calder before she married you, before she knew what he really was. When she realized, she ran, changed her life, buried her past. But he never forgot her, and he never forgave her for leaving. A cold tremor ran through me. Elliot, Roman added quietly, I'm not telling you this to hurt you. I'm telling you because you're stepping into a fight Calder believes he already won. I looked away, jaw tight. Jealousy, betrayal, grief. They all flared inside me, but none of them were stronger than fear for Jacob. Roman set the ring down and flipped open the notebook. He read silently, eyes narrowing as he reached the last page. Her warning was clear, he said. Calder will come back, and he won't come alone. I rubbed my forehead. Do you think he's using Nora as a way into the house? Yes, Roman said. And I think he's been watching your routines, testing boundaries, hoping you'll slip. Because the easiest way to access a legacy isn't through the living, it's through control of the incapacitated. My stomach dropped. He wants guardianship. He wants access. Roman corrected. Guardianship gives legal rights to property records, medical decisions, and anything Vivian might have hidden. And Nora is the perfect puppet, Roman finished. The realization felt like a bruise spreading across my ribs. I'd known Nora for 10 years. She was difficult, ambitious, sharp-tongued sometimes, but not cruel. Yet here she was, opening doors for a man who viewed her as disposable. Jacob's in danger, I said. And you, Roman added. Calder doesn't care who gets hurt. He only cares about protecting his empire. He stood abruptly. Show me the study. We walked to Vivian's old workspace. He immediately inspected the floor, the rug, the paintings, the shelves. His movements were precise, practiced. When he reached the bookshelf, he paused. Something's off, he murmured. What is it? He ran his hand along the back panel of the shelf. This wood is newer than the rest, and thinner. He knocked lightly, a hollow echo. Elliot, he said, help me move this. Together we pulled the shelf a few inches from the wall. Behind it, almost invisible under decades of dust, was a narrow indentation, like a seam. Roman slid his pocket knife along the edge, pried gently, and a small portion of the wall shifted outward, a hidden compartment. My heart hammered. Inside was a second notebook, thicker bound with twine, and a flash drive sealed in a plastic sleeve. Roman exhaled sharply. This is what he wants. My hands shook as I reached for the notebook. Vivian's handwriting covered the first page. If you are reading this, Elliot, then you've found the part of my life I never meant to leave behind. And now you must finish what I started. The man hunting this information will not stop. But neither can you. Roman touched my shoulder. We need to secure this immediately, and we need to prepare for what's coming. What is coming? I whispered. He met my eyes, his own steady and cold. A war, Elliot. A quiet one, but a war all the same. As he spoke, my phone buzzed. A message from Jacob. Dad, Nora is getting dressed. She says Calder is coming tonight. Roman sighed. Then we're out of time, he said. We move now. And for the first time in my life, I realized the battle for this house, this legacy, was only just beginning. Roman insisted we relocate to the kitchen before opening the thick notebook we'd found behind Vivian's bookshelf. Studies are too easy to surveil, he said, checking the blinds, the corners, the shadows. Kitchens have fewer hiding places for listening devices. I didn't argue. After the last few days, I wasn't sure what this house kept secrets from anymore. We sat at the table where Vivian and I had shared thousands of meals, thousands of quiet conversations. Now the air felt different, tight, humming with the tension of something long buried, rising to the surface. Roman cut the twine and opened the notebook carefully, as if it were a detonator instead of paper. What you're about to see, he warned, is the reason Calder Wynne has been circling you like a vulture. My hands tightened around my coffee mug as Roman turned the first page. It wasn't what I expected. Not lists or financial analysis. Photographs. Dozens of them tucked into sleeves, glued onto pages, annotated meticulously in Vivian's handwriting. Corporate buildings, warehouse docks, a private airstrip, a marina with unmarked crates. There were time-stamped shots of men exchanging briefcases, others of documents laid out on tables, captured through windows or half-open blinds. What is all this? I whispered. Evidence, Roman said. Dangerous evidence. The kind you don't bring to the police until you're ready to burn down everyone involved. He flipped to the next section, handwritten notes, coded lists, timelines. And then toward the bottom of the page, a name circled 3 times, Calder Wynne. My throat tightened. Roman pointed to a list beneath the name, 8 bullet points, each more damning than the last. Offshore laundering network, illegal campaign funneling, stolen intellectual property, threats against whistleblowers, contracted surveillance team, false front charities, shell corporations tied to arms deals, 2 suspicious deaths labeled accidents. I stared for a long moment, feeling the world tilt beneath me. Vivian had uncovered all this, and she had carried it alone. She was planning to expose him, I asked. Eventually, Roman said. But she knew Calder would retaliate, so she gathered verified and cross-verified. She needed every piece of it airtight. He turned another page. On it lay a map, our town at the center routes drawn outward like veins. Circled locations included my house. She marked our home, I murmured. Why, Roman studied the ink. These are entry points, surveillance positions. She must have noticed men watching this place years ago. I swallowed hard. And she didn't tell me. She was trying to protect you, Roman said gently. She thought if she hid enough of the danger, you'd never have to carry the burden she did. I stared at the pages. They blurred slightly. I didn't wipe the moisture from my eyes. She should have trusted me, I whispered. She did, Roman replied. That's why she left this for you, not Nora, not anyone else. I closed the notebook and exhaled shakily. Now what? I asked. Now we figure out what your wife left unfinished. Before Roman could say more, a sudden vibration crawled across the table, the plastic sleeve holding the flash drive. Roman reached for it, holding it up to the light. This, he said, could be everything. The digital archive of her work, backups, files she couldn't risk printing. Can you open it? Not here, he said. If Calder has anyone in the area monitoring network traffic, plugging this into your home computer would alert him in minutes. I blinked. That's possible, Roman gave me a look. Calder Wynn doesn't play impossible. He plays in inevitable. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, too exposed. I imagined invisible threads stretching from every outlet, every router, every window. Surveillance creeping in ways I'd never considered. A knock broke the silence. 3 short taps. Not on the door, on the window. Roman's body tensed instantly. He reached for the knife at his belt, moving silently to the side of the window frame. With one quick gesture, he signaled me to stay still. He peeked through a sliver in the curtain, then relaxed. It's Grace. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. When I opened the door, Grace looked pale, clutching a woven bag tightly to her chest. Elliot, she whispered, I think you need to see this. She stepped inside and pulled from her bag a small device, black square with a blinking red light. I found this under the eave outside your study window, she said. It wasn't there last week. Roman took it from her, turning it in his hands. A micro-surveillance unit, he muttered. High-end, military grade. Grace's voice trembled. Is someone spying on Elliot, yes? Roman said simply. Someone very serious. I sat down slowly, feeling nausea rise like a tide. Roman examined the device, then placed it into a small lead pouch he carried. It's off now. But this means Calder's people were here. Recently. How recently, I managed. Within 48 hours, Roman said. Grace closed her eyes as if praying silently. What do they want? She whispered. The same thing Vivian hid, Roman answered. The same thing Elliot and I just found. Grace looked at me, fear stirring in the depth of her eyes. Elliot, you need to leave the house. No, Roman said firmly. That's the worst thing he could do. Leaving tells Calder he's scared. Staying means we control the ground. I swallowed. I'm not leaving my home. Roman nodded approvingly. Good. Then we start preparing for what's next. Grace stayed for tea, mostly to calm her nerves. When she left, Roman and I returned to the table, so I said, You've seen what Vivian collected. What exactly is the next step? How do we stop? Calder. Roman rubbed his jaw. We can't stop him, not outright. But we can buy time, build evidence, move carefully. And the flash drive, I asked. I'll take it to a secure system tonight, Roman said. One he can't breach, not without a federal subpoena. I nodded slowly. What will we find on it? Roman's expression softened, almost sad. The truth, Elliot. All of it. Before he could explain further, my phone buzzed with a message from Nora. Dinner tonight at 6. It's important. You need to come. Roman leaned forward. Show me. I handed him the phone. She's desperate, he said. This isn't an invitation. It's a setup. Calder will be there. How do you know? I asked. Because he wants to test you, Roman replied. He wants to see if he can control you, manipulate you, intimidate you. A chill rippled through me. Are we going? I asked. Roman nodded once. Yes, but under my terms? What does that mean? He stood up, folding Vivian's notebook carefully. It means you're not walking into a trap alone, he said. If Calder Wynn wants a meeting, he'll get one. He looked at me with steady resolve. And he'll learn you're not the man he expected to face. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. And in that moment, for the first time since Vivian died, I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. Not fear, not grief, but a quiet, steady determination. Whatever storm Vivian foresaw, I was ready to walk straight into it. Roman drove. He insisted on it. He said it allowed him to control the approach, read the environment, and prevent Nora from claiming later that I arrived erratic or confused. That was how he thought every moment accounted for every possible threat mapped before it appeared. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the pine trees blur past the windows, feeling the tightening coil of anticipation in my chest. Dinner was at Nora and Jacob's house, a place I used to enter with pride, bringing holiday gifts or Vivian's baked bread. Tonight it felt like walking into enemy territory. "You don't speak unless necessary," Roman said as he turned onto their street. "Calder will try to provoke you. He'll want to see if you can be pushed or manipulated. Don't give him anything." "Understood," I murmured. "And if Nora says something outrageous, something hurtful, something that would normally make you defend yourself?" "I stay quiet," I finished. Roman nodded once. "Control is your weapon tonight." We pulled into the driveway. Their porch light was on, glowing too brightly against the settling dusk. Jacob stood at the window, hands shoved into his pockets, shoulders slumped. The moment he saw my face, guilt pooled across his features. Nora opened the door before we reached the steps. She greeted us with a smile so sweet, so polished, it should have come wrapped in foil like a poisoned candy. "Elliot," she exclaimed, "we're so glad you decided to join us." Her eyes flicked briefly to Roman, then widened in recognition or surprise, or perhaps realization that her carefully arranged stage now had an uninvited actor. "And you must be," she asked. "Roman Hale," he said calmly. "A friend of the family?" Her smile faltered. "Oh, Jacob didn't mention you were coming." "That's because he didn't know," Roman replied. Jacob stepped aside to let us enter. "Dad," he whispered, voice tight, "just be careful, okay?" I nodded. His warning wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was honest fear. The dining room was set as though for a holiday meal, fine china cloth napkins, candles flickering gently. Nora went overboard when she wanted to impress or distract, and standing at the head of the table, as though he belonged there, was a man I'd never met but recognized instantly from Vivian's notes. Calder Wynne. Tall, perfectly groomed, a presence that filled the room long before he spoke. His hair was silver at the temples, not from age but from refinement. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the world was his to rearrange at will. When our eyes met, he smiled with the warmth of a winter sun, bright enough to deceive, cold enough to freeze bone. "Mr. Mercer," he said, extending his hand, "I've been looking forward to meeting you." I didn't take his hand. Roman stepped between us, subtly forcing Calder to lower it. "We're here for dinner," Roman reminded him quietly. "Not introductions." Calder's smile thinned. "Of course." We sat. Nora bustled around, pouring wine, arranging dishes, talking too quickly, too brightly. Jacob barely touched his food. Roman didn't eat at all. He watched, studied, calculated. Calder finally folded his napkin and placed his hands on the table with an almost ceremonial grace. "Nora tells me you've been under a lot of stress lately, Elliot." I didn't respond. "She says the house may be too much for one man," he continued. "Grief can cloud judgment, make responsibilities feel heavier than they truly are." Roman's eyes flicked to me, reminding me to remain silent. Calder's voice deepened ever so slightly. "There are options available for men in your position, options that ensure safety, stability, peace of mind." Like what Jacob asked quietly. Calder turned to him with feigned sympathy. "Temporary guardianship, for instance. Nothing drastic, just until your father feels more grounded." I felt Jacob stiffen. His eyes darted to me, then to Nora, then back to Calder. "You said we weren't going to pressure him," Jacob whispered. Nora shot him a warning glare. "We're not. We're just offering help." Roman leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Help," he repeated. Interesting word choice, especially from someone who's been entering Elliot's property uninvited. Nora's face blanched. "That's a lie?" Is it? Roman asked calmly. Because I have photographic evidence. Time-stamped. Calder's eyes sharpened like a blade catching the light. Let's not escalate things unnecessarily, Calder said smoothly. Jacob, Nora, why don't you get dessert ready? I'd like a word alone with Mr. Mercer. Roman straightened. That won't happen. Calder ignored him. It's all right, I said, surprising myself and them. Roman can stay. Calder finally turned his full attention to me. Vivian left things unfinished, he said softly. Things I believe are now in your possession. The air in the room thickened. Jacob looked confused. Nora's fingers tightened around the dessert platter. What things? She demanded. What is he talking about? Calder didn't acknowledge her. His gaze stayed locked on mine. You've been exploring her study, he continued. You've read her notes. You've discovered pieces she never meant for you to find alone. My pulse thudded steady and controlled. You think my wife left something of value? I said. Calder smiled. I don't think. I know. And you believe it belongs to you. The smile widened. Correction. I believe it was connected to me. Vivian and I knew each other long before she met you. She kept things. Records. Evidence. Roman's jaw clenched. You mean evidence of your crimes? Calder's expression didn't change. I mean mementos of a complicated history. I felt heat rise under my collar. Vivian wasn't yours? Calder chuckled. Elliot, you truly have no idea what legacy you married into. Jacob swallowed audibly. What are you saying? Calder shifted his gaze to him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I'm saying your mother and I shared a past. A meaningful one. One with consequences. Jacob's face drained of color. Consequences? Nora blinked confused, unsure whether this revelation helped her or shattered her footing. Roman spoke first. Don't. Calder ignored him. Jacob Calder said softly, I knew your mother before she knew your father. A beat of silence, a long, terrible beat. Then, no. Jacob whispered. No, that's not my mother would have told me. She would have told my dad. She chose stability, Calder replied. Chose safety. Elliot could give her that. I could not. I felt my breath seize in my chest. Not because of jealousy. Not because of betrayal. But because Jacob, my son, my boy, was shaking uncontrollably. Calder continued unbothered by the pain he inflicted. What Vivian uncovered later in life, he said, had nothing to do with our past relationship. It had to do with business. She discovered information that would have destroyed my company. So she hid it. Somewhere in your home. Nora sucked in a sharp breath. So the rumors were true. There is something in that house. Calder still didn't look at her. She was not the one he came for. He leaned forward, eyes boring into mine with unsettling certainty. Give me what I want, Elliot, he murmured. And all of this goes away. Roman stood abruptly. Conversation's over. Calder rose with unhurried calm. No. The conversation has just begun. He stepped closer to me, lowering his voice to a whisper. You are standing in a war you do not understand, and you're holding a weapon you cannot comprehend. Choose wisely who you allow near it. Then, loud enough for the room, we will speak again. He walked out the front door before anyone could stop him. Nora stared after him, torn between awe and fear. Jacob stared at the floor, trembling. Roman watched the door as though expecting Calder to return with reinforcements. I simply sat there, feeling the world I thought I knew tilt into something colder, darker, and entirely unfamiliar. Jacob finally looked up at me with tear-filled eyes. Dad, he whispered. Is any of that true? I didn't have an answer yet. But I knew one thing. Whatever Vivian had left behind, it was powerful enough to draw a man like Calder Wynn to my door. and dangerous enough to destroy everything if I mishandled it. Jacob didn't speak on the drive back to my house. He sat in the back seat of Roman's SUV, curled inward, elbows on his knees, face buried in his hands, like a child trying to hide from a nightmare. Except this nightmare was real, and it had a name: Calder Wynn. When Roman pulled into my driveway, the porch light flicked on, automatically illuminating the quiet yard. The house looked peaceful, untouched. But we all knew that peace had teeth behind it now. Jacob finally lifted his face. His eyes were red-rimmed, swollen. "Dad," he said hoarsely, "if any of what he said about Mom is true, then what does that make me?" I turned in my seat. "Jacob," I said softly, "you are my son. That's the only thing that matters. But what if—" "No," I said sharper this time. "You listen to me. You are mine, not because of a name on a piece of paper, not because of DNA, but because of every day of your life I raised you. Calder Wynn didn't teach you to ride a bike. He didn't sit with you through storms. He didn't stay up fixing your science projects or mend your scraped knees." Jacob closed his eyes. A single tear slipped down. "He doesn't get to claim you," I added quietly. "Not now, not ever." Roman spoke from the driver's seat without turning. "Calder told you the truth he needed you to hear, not the truth that actually exists." Jacob frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Roman said, stepping out, "that Calder Wynn never tells the whole story. He tells the portion that gets him what he wants." We followed him inside. The air felt still, as if the house had been holding its breath, waiting for our return. Roman locked the door behind us, double-checked the windows, then nodded toward the living room. "Sit," he said to Jacob. "You need to hear this." Jacob dropped onto the couch. I sat beside him, feeling the old familiar instinct to shield him from whatever storm we were about to walk into. Roman remained standing, pacing slowly, gathering his thoughts. "Your mother," he said to Jacob, "did know Calder." That part was true. But their relationship was nothing like he claimed. Jacob's head snapped up. So they weren't no Roman cut-in. Vivian didn't love him. She didn't choose him. She met him through work years ago when he was funding a research firm. At first he played the role of a charming patron, but when Vivian started uncovering evidence of his financial schemes, he shifted. My heart clenched. Roman's voice lowered. He became possessive, tried to coerce her into a relationship, tried to get leverage on her so she'd stay quiet. When she refused, he made threats. Jacob breathed in sharply. He only backed off. Roman continued, "When Vivian disappeared from the project and rebuilt her life here far from him." "And Dad?" Jacob whispered. "Did she ever tell him?" "No," Roman said. "Because she didn't want Elliot pulled into something dangerous. She wanted a clean start. And she found it with him." Jacob swallowed hard. "Then what was Calder talking about tonight?" "The consequences of their past manipulation," Roman said simply. "Pure, calculated manipulation." He looked at Jacob. "He wants you to doubt yourself, doubt your father, doubt your mother's love, because uncertainty makes people pliable." Jacob stared at the floor. "I feel sick," Roman softened his tone. "I know, but listen, Calder isn't after you. He's after what Vivian discovered. You're just another lever he can pull to get to Elliot." And Nora, Jacob asked quietly. "She's a convenient tool," Roman said. "She thinks she'll gain something by helping him, your house, your asset status. Calder lets her believe that as long as it keeps pressure on Elliot." Jacob rubbed his temples. "She's not a bad person. She's just lost. She thinks she's helping me." Roman raised an eyebrow. "Does helping you usually involve lying, controlling your access to your father, and arranging guardianship behind your back?" Jacob's silence was the answer. I placed a hand on his shoulder. He leaned into it like he did when he was small and exhausted from crying. Roman cleared his throat. "All right. Enough emotions for now. We have work to do." "What kind of work?" Jacob asked. the kind Roman said, lifting Vivian's notebook that gets us ahead of Calder before he makes his next move. He opened the notebook on the table and pointed to a page marked with a small star in Vivian's handwriting. She left clues, Roman said. All over this house. There's something else hidden here, something bigger than the notebooks. Jacob sat forward. What kind of clues? The kind, Roman said, that lead to what Calder really wants. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the ring with the initials CW. When did she hide this? I murmured. Years ago, Roman replied. Before she ever got sick. She knew Calder might come someday. She prepared a trail for the right person to follow. And that person is Elliot, Jacob said. Roman nodded. Vivian trusted him to finish what she couldn't. He spread out several pages from the notebook sketches of the house layout annotations, in margins numbers written in odd sequences, a symbol resembling a broken compass drawn repeatedly. What is all this? I asked. A code, Roman said. Vivian was brilliant, but she didn't rely on memory. She encoded her findings, her locations, her warnings. And you can break it? Jacob asked. I can try, Roman replied. But it'll take time. How much time? I asked. Roman's expression darkened. Less than we have. He stepped away from the table and walked toward the back hallway. Vivian marked 3 suspicious locations in her notes, he said. The fireplace foundation, the attic support beam, and the basement wall behind the old workbench. That basement wall? I asked. There's nothing behind it but concrete. Roman shook his head. No. There's something. Vivian wouldn't have marked it otherwise. He turned to Jacob. You're staying here tonight. Jacob blinked. What? No, I should go home and do what Roman asked. Give Nora information. Pretend everything is normal. Risk her calling Calder and telling him you're cracking. The truth landed hard. Jacob slumped. She'll be furious if I don't come home. That's the least of your problems, Roman said. Right now, Calder is deciding whether to move quietly or force your father out of this house. The more he thinks you're under Nora's influence, the more leverage he believes he has. So staying here makes it look like I've switched sides, Jacob said slowly. Roman nodded. It tells Calder he can't use you as easily. Jacob looked at me. Is that okay? If I stay, I placed a hand on his shoulder. I want you here. His eyes softened in relief. Roman straightened all business again. We start with the attic. Vivian left the clearest clues about that location. Jacob stood. I'll get a flashlight. And I'll get my pry tools, Roman said. I followed them toward the stairs, feeling the strange, surreal weight of what was happening. 2 days ago, my biggest worry was whether the roses needed trimming. Now I was climbing into the attic with my son and a man who used to work for federal intelligence, searching for evidence my wife hid to protect us from a man powerful enough to bury nations with a phone call. The attic smelled like dust and cedar. Roman crouched immediately near the central support beam, scanning for markings. Jacob shone the flashlight steadily, his hand surprisingly stable despite everything. There, Roman said. A tiny symbol, Vivian's broken compass, etched into the wood grain. Roman pressed gently along the beam. Something clicked. A panel loosened. Jacob gasped. She built a compartment in the attic beam. Vivian was full of surprises, Roman murmured. He removed the wooden panel and reached inside, pulling out a narrow metal tube sealed with a screw cap. I felt the air thicken, anticipation, dread, hope tangled together. Roman unscrewed the cap and slid out a folded piece of paper and a small metallic object. What is it? Jacob asked. Roman held the metallic piece up to the flashlight. It was a key, a very old key, and Vivian's handwriting on the paper read, "For Elliot. When the time comes, the truth will be deeper than the walls. Trust only the one who stands beside you in the dark." Jacob whispered, "What did Mom hide in this house?" I took the key, feeling its cold weight in my palm. "I don't know," I said. But I knew we were about to find out. And Calder Wynne wouldn't be far behind. Roman turned the old key over in his hand, as if measuring its history by touch alone. The attic was silent, except for the soft click of metal against his thumb. Jacob stood beside me with the flashlight, its beam gliding across insulation and rafters like a thin silver river. "What does it open?" Jacob whispered. Roman didn't answer yet. He held the key to the light, studying its design. "This isn't a house key. Not a storage key. Not a lockbox key." He tapped the ornate bow of the key with his knuckle. "This is for something handmade. Custom. Something Vivian didn't want, couldn't risk being broken into." My heartbeat thudded hard against my ribs. If she hid this key inside the attic beam, I murmured, whatever it opens must be important, Roman finished, and hidden somewhere down below. Vivian avoided storing sensitive material above ground. Too vulnerable. Jacob angled the flashlight toward the attic ladder. "So we check the basement next." Roman nodded once. "Yes, but slowly. If Calder has already tried to access the house, he may have left sensors or fiber cams in entry points. We can't assume he failed." A cold ripple slid through me. "You think he's been inside?" "I think Roman said he's always closer than we realize." Jacob's shoulders trembled at that, and I placed a hand on his back, steadying him. "We're together," I said quietly. "He can't use either of us against the other now." Roman closed the attic compartment carefully and motioned for us to climb down before him. "Let's see what your wife wanted you to find." Downstairs, the house looked unchanged, peaceful, domestic, familiar. The kind of place where Vivian would have simmered soup or hummed softly while sorting her notes. But beneath that warmth was a ticking sense of danger, a pressure in the air like weather shifting toward a storm. Roman led the way to the basement door, checking the frame for tampering. Jacob hesitated on the top step. "Dad, what if this is something big? I mean, bigger than anything we're prepared for." "It already is," Roman replied. "But we're here now. We keep going." I followed Roman down the steps, the wooden boards creaking beneath our weight. The basement smelled like old wood and concrete dust, familiar, but sharper now. Roman snapped a small tactical flashlight onto his belt and swept the beam slowly across the walls. "Vivian marked 3 areas," he said. "This one first." He approached the far wall, the one behind my old workbench. A wall I'd assumed was part of the original foundation. Nothing special, nothing noteworthy. Yet Vivian had circled it 3 times in her notebook. Roman pressed his ear against the concrete, knocked twice, listened. "It's hollow," he murmured. "Thinner than the rest." Jacob's voice wavered. She built a false wall. Looks like it." Roman curled his fingers along the top edge, feeling for a seam. "Help me move the bench." Together we dragged the heavy wooden workbench aside. Dust swirled into the flashlight beam and drifted down like pale ash. Behind where the bench once stood, a long vertical groove was visible, almost invisible, unless you were looking for it. Roman pointed. "That's the seam." I swallowed. So the key Roman fit the old key into a nearly invisible keyhole near the base of the seam. It slid in smoothly. Jacob held his breath. I held mine. Roman turned the key. A metallic click echoed across the basement, a sound that didn't belong to a century-old house. Then the wall panel shifted outward, almost imperceptibly. Roman stepped back. "Elliot," he said quietly, "she built this for you to open." I placed my hand on the panel, felt the slightest give, and pushed. The hidden door swung open. Behind it was not a room, but a vault. A narrow steel locker built directly into the wall, reinforced with latches and stacked compartments. My heart pounded, my breath tight in my chest. Vivian had constructed something out of spy films and intelligence briefings, something I never would have imagined her capable of. Roman let out a low whistle. She didn't trust digital storage alone. Smart woman. Jacob Whisper questioned, "What's inside?" I reached for the top latch, hands trembling, and lifted it. The first compartment held binders, at least a dozen, each labeled in Vivian's handwriting, Win, offshore accounts, Win, property holdings, Win, corporate escrow transfers, Win, witness statements, confidential, Win, payments to law firms, Win, internal communications. Jacob stared stunned. She collected this much on one man. Roman answered, because he was more than a man. He was a machine that destroyed anything in his way. I pulled out the second drawer. It contained photographs, hundreds, maybe thousands, organized in envelopes. Surveillance shots of senators with Win affiliates. Close-ups of documents being exchanged in parking garages. Images of men in suits, standing near restricted areas. I recognized some of them from the notebook. But there were more, so much more. Roman sifted through the photos quickly. These could put away half the people he's protected by. This is enough to burn down empires. I opened the third drawer. Inside it were 2 metal tins. Inside one stacks of USB drives labeled only with numbers. The second tin contained a set of audio cassettes, old-school analog recordings, each marked with a date. One caught my eye. A date from years before Jacob was born. I reached for it. Roman placed a hand over mine. Careful. Whatever's on these. Vivian didn't want anyone to hear without preparation. Jacob whispered, Dad, this is insane. No, Roman corrected. This is war. I pulled my hand back. There was one more compartment. A small drawer near the bottom secured by its own metal latch. The handwriting on the label was softer, more personal. For Elliot only. My chest tightened. Without speaking, I unlatched it and slowly opened it. Inside was a small velvet pouch. I opened it. A second key fell into my palm, this one gold polished with a more ornate design. And beneath it lay folded pages, handwritten, dated 5 months before Vivian died. My throat constricted painfully. Jacob stepped forward. Dad, are you okay? I couldn't answer. Not yet. Roman gently said, You should read it alone. I want him here, I whispered. I want Jacob with me. Jacob blinked rapidly, emotion softening his features. He stepped beside me, steady and quiet. I unfolded the letter. Vivian's handwriting flowed across the page, elegant and familiar, each loop pulling me back to her presence, my love. If you are reading this, then the storm I feared has finally reached our home. I wish I could have protected you from all of it, but life rarely bends to our wishes. Please know that every decision I made was out of love, love for you, love for Jacob, and love for the life we built in this home. My breath shuddered. I continued. You will hear lies from Calder Wynn, lies about our past, lies designed to break your heart and turn our son against us. He will tell half-truths and shadows to make the light seem dimmer. Do not believe him. He is not Jacob's father. He never was. And he will use whatever story keeps him closest to what he wants. Jacob gasped softly behind me. I read on. What he wants is not you. It is not me. It is what I discovered years ago, evidence that could unravel his empire, evidence he believes he lost. But he never knew I hid it here in the walls of our home, protected by the one man I trusted above all others. I gripped the page tighter. Roman Hale will help you. He saved my life once. He will save yours now. Trust him. Roman looked down, jaw clenched. The final lines trembled in my grasp. Elliot, if this reaches your hands, then you are the last barrier between Calder Wynn and everything he has built through deceit. You must be brave. You must hold the line, and you must tell Jacob the truth, that he is our son, ours, and nothing will ever change that. I love you with every breath I have left. Vivian. The page blurred as tears gathered. Jacob stepped closer, placing a hand on my shoulder, voice breaking. Dad. She wrote that. She wanted me to know. I turned to him. You are my son, always. He nodded, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Roman stepped back, giving us space, yet watching the vault with a strategist's eyes. "We have what we need," he said. "Enough to destroy Calder. Enough to protect this family." But his voice tightened. "And enough to make him very, very desperate." That was when my phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. "You opened it. We need to talk. Tomorrow. Midnight. Come alone." Roman read it over my shoulder. "He knows," he whispered. "He knows you found the vault." The air thickened. Jacob's voice trembled. "Dad, what does he want?" I closed the vault, locked it with both keys, and whispered, "He wants the truth buried." And I knew deep in my bones I would never let that happen. I didn't sleep the night Calder Wynne texted me. I sat in the armchair in the living room, lights off, watching the sky lighten inch by inch through the window as dawn crept over the lake. Roman paced the length of the house like a sentry. Jacob drifted in and out of the kitchen, opening the fridge, closing it, not eating a thing. Every clock tick seemed louder than usual, as if the house itself was warning us we were running out of time. Calder had given me a deadline, midnight tonight. But Roman insisted we meet him on our terms. "He wants to dictate to the battleground," Roman said as he dropped into the chair opposite me. "We're not giving him that advantage." "Then where?" Jacob asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Here," Roman answered. "You don't leave this house until the judge meeting tomorrow morning. That's when we make our move." I rubbed my temples. "And what do we do when he shows up tonight?" Roman stopped him pacing. "We don't open the door." I looked up sharply. "You think he'll attack the house?" "No," Roman said. "He'll attack your mind. He'll try to twist the story. He'll make you doubt yourself. He'll make you believe the only way to protect Jacob is to hand everything over." I set my jaw. "I won't." "Good," Roman said. "Because Calder is a man who wins by convincing you he already has." Jacob sank onto the couch. "Dad, about what he said last night. About Mom, about me." His voice cracked. "I still don't understand why he'd lie about that." "Because he knows exactly where to aim," Roman said, gently surprising me with the softness in his voice. A lie carefully placed at an old wound can feel like truth. Jacob stared at the floor. "I feel stupid. Nora manipulated me. Calder manipulated me. I didn't see any of it." "You weren't stupid," I said. "You trusted people who said they were family." "There's nothing wrong with that," Roman added. "But now you know the truth, and knowledge is leverage." Jacob exhaled shakily and nodded. The hours crawled toward noon. I made coffee, poured it, then forgot to drink it. Roman ran through scenarios, Calder trying to break in. Calder using the sheriff to perform a welfare check, Calder convincing Nora to file emergency motions before morning. "He'll use every legal loophole," Roman said. "But we've already closed them." "How?" Jacob asked. Roman turned to him. "The moment you told the judge the truth, you destroyed her entire leverage. Nora won't recover from that. Calder knows it. That's why he's desperate now." Then came the unexpected knock. A single soft tap. Grace stood on the porch, eyes worried, a small tin clasped in her hands. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, stepping inside, "but I found this in my mailbox this morning." She pressed the tin into my palms. It was cold, heavier than it looked. "There's no return address," she said. "But Elliot, it was wrapped in a plain envelope with your name typed on it." My stomach tightened. Roman motioned for me to put it on the table. He swept it for wires, weight, triggers, anything unusual. Satisfied, he nodded. "Open it." I lifted the lid. Inside lay a tiny recording device. A digital one, sleek, modern, the kind that could slip into a pocket unnoticed. And there was a single card, "Play me," alone. Roman swore under his breath. "This is Calder. He wants to get into your head," Jacob said. "So let's not let him," Roman replied. But I shook my head. "No, I need to hear it." Roman hesitated. "Elliot, I need to know what he thinks he has," I said, "and what he thinks I don't." Roman reluctantly plugged the device into a small portable speaker. The recording crackled to life. Then Calder's voice filled the room, smooth, composed, confident. "Elliot," he began, "I'm disappointed you didn't join me last night. But that's all right. We'll have our conversation soon enough." He paused. "I want to offer you something. A truth you've already begun to suspect." Jacob tensed. "Vivian kept secrets from you," Calder continued. "Secrets about her past, about the people she worked for, and about the son you both raised." Jacob swallowed hard. "But the biggest secret," Calder said, "is what she hid in your walls. Something she was never meant to have. Something I intend to reclaim." Roman crossed his arms tightly. "You cannot win this," Calder said, voice velvet smooth. "You are an aging man clinging to a crumbling house. I am a man with resources you cannot imagine. Let go. Give me what I want, and this ends peacefully. Refuse, and you will lose far more than documents." The recording clicked off. The room fell silent. Jacob looked at me with panic rising behind his eyes. "Dad, this is a threat. He's threatening you. He's threatening all of us," I said. Roman unplugged the device, jaw clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched along his cheek. "He's rattled. He wouldn't have sent this if he had control." "So what do we do?" Jacob asked. "We prepare," Roman said. "Tonight he'll try to corner Elliot. But tomorrow morning," he looked at me, "tomorrow we destroy him." The rest of the afternoon spiraled into strategy. Roman hid the vault keys in 3 separate locations. We moved sensitive documents into fireproof bags. He walked me through what to say, before the judge what not to say, how to stay calm, even if Nora presented new lies. But it was Jacob who pulled me aside near sunset, his hands shaking. "Dad, I have to tell you something." My heart clenched. "What is it?" "It's about Mom," he whispered. "And Nora. And the night Mom died." I froze. Jacob swallowed hard. Nora told me once, months ago, something I didn't understand at the time. Something about Mom getting sick after she went on a business trip. Something about a meeting she shouldn't have attended. I leaned against the counter to steady myself. "She said Jacob whispered that Mom had been warned not to go. That someone told her she was digging too deep. And that she went anyway." "Who told her not to go?" I asked, though dread was already crawling into my bones. Jacob's lips trembled. "Calder. It had to be Calder." Roman inhaled sharply. "That means Vivian was closer to exposing him than I thought." Jacob looked at both of us distraught. "Did he hurt her? Did he do something to her?" "No," Roman said firmly. "Her illness was real, Jacob. Aggressive, but real. Calder doesn't murder to hide secrets, not directly. He destroys livelihoods, families, reputations. But killing Vivian would have drawn too much attention. But something in Roman's eyes said he wasn't entirely certain." As night settled, the house grew still. Jacob sat at the table with his head resting in his hands. Roman stood guard near the window, watching the tree line. I paced the living room, waiting for whatever Calder thought he could achieve at midnight. Waiting for a ghost from my wife's past to show himself fully. But instead, at precisely 11:30, my phone buzzed again. A new message. "You're late. I'm already inside." I froze. Roman turned instantly, reading my expression. "What does it say?" I showed him. He didn't hesitate. "Jacob, get behind me. Elliot, stay close." He moved through the house like a storm, checking rooms, hallways, closets. Nothing. No doors opened. No windows cracked. No signs of forced entry. Then my phone buzzed again. "You won't find me by searching rooms. You'll find me by facing the truth. Meet me where Vivian kept her secrets." "The study." Roman swore softly. He's playing psychological warfare. But Jacob whispered, or he already planted someone inside. We approached Vivian's study cautiously. The door was open. A single sheet of paper lay on the desk. Roman picked it up. When he read it, a muscle jumped in his jaw. "What?" I asked. He handed it to me. A note, 4 words handwritten in ink I recognized instantly. "You're not alone." I sank into the chair, breath trembling from somewhere deep in my chest. "Dad?" Jacob whispered. Roman spoke quietly. "This isn't Calder's handwriting." "It's hers?" "Impossible," Jacob said. "No," I whispered, staring at the ink. "Not impossible. Because the ink was faded. Because the paper was worn. Because the edges suggested it had been tucked somewhere for years. This wasn't a message left tonight. It was a message Vivian hid long ago, waiting for the night I'd finally need it. The night Calder Wynne would push me to the edge. And somehow, despite everything rising against us, Vivian had left a final whisper of strength. Roman placed a hand on my shoulder. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we walk into the judge's chambers and turn the tide." I looked at the note again. "You're not alone." For the first time since Vivian died, I believed it. The courthouse smelled like old wood and colder judgment. I stepped through the front doors with the flutter of papers tucked under my arm and Roman just behind me, alert scanning faces, scanning exits. Jacob walked on my other side, shoulders drawn tight. If anyone had told me 6 months ago that my son and I would be arriving at a legal hearing because his wife and a corporate predator were trying to take my home, I wouldn't have believed them. But here we were. Nora stood near the check-in counter, wearing a charcoal blazer and a soft blouse, her hair pinned neatly, her expression arranged in a fragile approximation of concern. She looked like a woman preparing to ask a judge to rescue her father-in-law from imagined instability. She looked like innocence wrapped around a blade. When her eyes met mine, she brightened falsely. "Elliot," she said softly, stepping forward as if greeting a grieving widower at a funeral. "I'm glad you made it. I've been so worried about you." Roman stepped subtly between us. Nora's smile vanished for an instant before she recovered it. "You didn't have to bring security." "He's not security," Jacob said flatly. "He's a family friend." Nora's eyebrows rose slightly in offended confusion. "Jacob's sweetheart?" "Don't," he whispered. Just one word, but heavy enough that her lips snapped shut. She hadn't expected resistance from him. Her attorney appeared beside her, clutching a briefcase and wearing the smug confidence of a man who thought he had a winning case. "Mr. Mercer," he greeted me, extending a hand. "We're sorry it came to this." Roman didn't let me take the handshake. "The only thing you're sorry about," Roman said calmly, "is that the truth hasn't caught up to your client yet." Nora frowned. "Threats won't help you, Mr. Hale." "Neither will lies," Roman answered. Before she could reply, the bailiff called our case. Guardianship petition of Mercer Elliott, courtroom 3. My pulse hammered as we walked in. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, glasses perched low on her nose, and an expression that suggested she valued truth above theatrics. Her gavel sat on the bench like an unspoken warning. We took our seats. Nora sat across the room with her attorney. She placed a hand delicately atop a stack of papers, as if she'd practiced the pose in the mirror. Concerned but dignified. The judge glanced over the file. "Mrs. Gray," she began, "you've filed for emergency guardianship of your father-in-law, claiming he is unable to manage his affairs independently due to alleged cognitive decline. Before we begin, do you have additional evidence to submit?" "Yes, Your Honor," Nora said, standing smoothly. "I have statements from neighbors, observations from family members, and concerns regarding safety in Mr. Mercer's residence." Her attorney handed documents to the bailiff. I held still, letting Roman's words echo in my mind. "Control is your weapon today." Nora launched into her testimony. She spoke of my forgetfulness, my erratic moods, my inability to maintain the property alone. Her voice cracked at the right moments. She dabbed tears she didn't feel. She painted herself as a compassionate daughter-in-law, trying desperately to help a stubborn old man who didn't know he needed saving. Jacob's jaw tightened with each lie. "What about the alleged break-ins Mr. Mercer reported?" the judge asked. Nora gave a sad, pitying smile. He imagined those, she said. My husband and I were the ones knocking that morning. We were worried he'd fallen or been injured. We only brought the hammer because, well, we feared the worst. Roman leaned toward me. She's overplaying it. The judge nodded slowly. I see. And the legal documents you presented that morning, according to the sheriff's report, they appeared to be falsified. Nora's face flushed. I was misled by someone who claimed to be a paralegal. I would never intentionally present false documents. I was trying to fulfill my duty to protect Elliot. The judge raised an eyebrow. Very well. Mr. Mercer, your response? I stood slowly. My wife, Vivian, left certain protections in place before she died. I began. Protections she made because she trusted I would know when to use them. I handed the judge a folder. Roman had prepared surveillance images of Nora entering my home, timestamps of suspicious activity, a statement from Grace, and evidence of the forged papers. This is not concern, I said quietly. This is control. Nora sucked in a sharp breath. That is not true. The judge held up a hand. You may respond later, Mrs. Gray. Mrs. Gray? Roman stood next. The judge peered over her glasses. And you are Roman Hale, he said. I was hired by Vivian Mercer years ago to monitor suspicious activity around her research. I continued assisting the family after her passing at her written request. Jacob's head snapped toward him. He didn't know this part. Roman continued, voice steady. Nora Gray has visited the property uninvited on multiple occasions. She rummaged through Vivian's study. She held conversations with an unidentified man discussing documents hidden in the home. She lied to the sheriff's department, and she has coordinated with individuals connected to corporate fraud investigations. Nora shot to her feet. That's absurd. I didn't... The judge's gavel struck the bench sharply. Sit down, Mrs. Gray. Jacob rose next. He didn't wait to be prompted. Your Honor, he said, voice trembling but clear. There's something you need to know, Nora whispered urgently. Jacob, don't... He stepped away from her. My wife manipulated me, he said. She told me my father was losing his mind. She pressured me to support guardianship. She even recorded conversations with my dad to make him seem confused. I believed her, until I heard her speaking to a man named Calder Wynn. The room rippled. Even the judge straightened. He told her to get my father out of his home, Jacob continued. He said there was something inside the house that belonged to him. Nora agreed. She said she deserved the house, that it would be ours if we helped him. Nora's chair screeched as she jumped to her feet again. Jacob, stop. You don't know what you're saying. Jacob turned toward her, and the grief in his eyes was devastating. You used me, he whispered. You used Dad. You used Mom's death. The judge tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. Mrs. Gray, do you deny speaking with Mr. Wynn? I don't have to answer that, Nora stammered. You do, the judge said sternly, if you want this court to believe you're acting in good faith. But Nora was unraveling. Her eyes darted across the room. I could almost see the gears of desperation turning behind them. He lied to me, she cried. Calder said Elliot was hiding assets. Said the house was going to fall into probate. Said if we didn't intervene, Jacob would lose everything. I was trying to protect our family. You were trying to steal my home, I said quietly. It wasn't angry. It was simply true. Nora's face crumpled. You don't understand, Elliot. Calder promised. She stopped. The judge leaned forward. Promised what Nora's fingers trembled. Promised that when Elliot was declared incompetent, the property would transfer. That the assets would be safe. A beat of silence. That we would be safe. Rome exhaled almost sadly. He used you, the same way he used everyone. The judge set down the folder of evidence and folded her hands deliberately. Mrs. Gray, you have admitted to acting on fraudulent legal advice, collaborating with an outside party to obtain access to property, and misrepresenting Mr. Mercer's mental state. Given this testimony and the documented evidence, your petition is denied. Nora swayed. Furthermore, the judge continued, I am forwarding this case for investigation of attempted elder abuse fraud and conspiracy to commit unlawful property acquisition. Nora's face collapsed into panic. No, I didn't mean Jacob. Tell her I was trying to help. Jacob looked away. It's over, Nora, he said softly. The judge announced the final ruling, formal, sharp, decisive. I was still legally competent. Nora was barred from filing any additional petitions, and the persistent intrusions into my home were now under official criminal scrutiny. As the bailiff called for the next case, Nora reached for Jacob, her voice breaking. Please, don't leave me alone in this. Jacob shook his head. I already did, Nora, and you used that trust to hurt the only parent I have left. She went still. Her attorney whispered urgently, trying to usher her out of the room. She didn't move. She just stared at me with hollow confusion, as if genuinely unsure how everything had slipped from her hands. Roman touched my arm. Let's go. As we stepped into the hallway, Jacob walked close beside me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, the cold wind swept sharp across the pavement, clearing the taste of judgment from the air. That's one battle, Roman said quietly. Not the war. My phone buzzed. A new message from an unknown number. You may have won in court, but the ledger still belongs to me. We finish this tonight. CW. I closed my eyes. The war had just begun. Calder Wynn's message followed me home like a shadow. Even after the courthouse faded behind us and the long stretch of forested highway opened ahead, I could feel the weight of those words pressing against the back of my ribs. We finish this tonight. It was not a threat. It was a promise. And promises from men like Calder were the kind that came with consequences. Roman drove. Jacob sat in the back seat, hunched forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the screen of his phone as if trying to decipher the message for hidden meaning. He's cornered, Roman said quietly, eyes on the road. Cornered men get loud. They make dramatic gestures. But they don't win. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that Vivian's protections, our testimony, the judge's ruling, all of it had finally broken Calder's hold. But there was something in his final message that struck deeper than anger. Something familiar. Not rage. Resolve. When we pulled into the driveway, the lake house rose in the glow of late afternoon, calm and timeless as ever. Birds darted through the pines, and the water shimmered in slow, glassy ripples. If a stranger looked at it, they'd see peace. But I saw a battleground. The three of us walked inside together. Roman checked every window, every room, every lock. Jacob headed upstairs to catch his breath. I moved into the kitchen where sunlight poured across the counter the way it always had when Vivian cooked Sunday dinner. For a moment I felt her beside me, warm, steady, certain. Then footsteps approached. Roman joined me, folding his arms. He doesn't want violence, he said. He wants leverage. He thinks you have something he can still claim. He thinks he deserves it, I said. Roman nodded. Which means the next move is yours. But it has to be the right one. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the second key Vivian had hidden, the gold one. The one she'd left with a message meant for me alone. I hadn't used it yet. I wasn't sure whether I should. But now, Roman, I said softly, this key, it isn't for the vault, he frowned. Then what is it for? I drew in a breath. Vivian didn't just hide documents. She hid a contingency, a last option, something she prayed I would never need. Roman's expression sharpened. Where? Not here, I said. Down by the lake. Because beneath the boathouse floorboards, under the very planks Vivian and I had nailed down together, 35 years ago, there was a second compartment, a deeper one. A place she had insisted on reinforcing, just in case. We walked down to the dock as dusk began to settle, the water turning cold and metallic. Inside the boathouse, I knelt beside the old cedar boards and slid the key into a tiny brass fitting, almost invisible to the eye. A soft click echoed. The floor panel loosened. Roman knelt beside me. Inside the compartment lay a black waterproof case, sleek, heavy, untouched for years. My hands trembled as I lifted it. I opened the lid. Inside lay 3 items: a leather binder, a flash drive sealed in a Ziploc sleeve, and a small silver recorder. Roman inhaled sharply. She made a master file. My throat tightened. She always planned ahead. The binder contained duplicates of everything from the vault, every offshore account, every paper trail, every confession Calder had hoped was buried. And the flash drive, it held the unedited version of a recording Calder had thought he erased years ago. The one that tied his name to a bribe list spanning half the state. Roman held the recorder carefully. This could ruin him. That's the idea, I said. We carried the case back to the house. Jacob met us in the living room, eyes wide when he saw what we brought. Dad, is that... It's the end of this, I said. Night fell before we were ready. The message from Calder had said tonight, but not where, not how. And that made the waiting worse. The house creaked with every wind gust. The lake lapped quietly against the shore. Jacob paced. Roman watched the windows. I sat in my old armchair, gripping the binder. Then around 9:45, headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. One car, black, unhurried, purposeful. Roman stood. Stay behind me. Jacob swallowed hard. Dad. I'm right here, I told him. A single figure stepped out of the car. No one else. Calder Wynne walked toward the house with the confidence of a man entering his own office, not the home of the family he'd tried to dismantle. He wore a navy coat tailored perfectly, his face calm, controlled, dangerous. Roman opened the door before Calder could knock. No weapons, Roman said. Calder raised his hands mockingly. Do I look like a thug to you, Hale? Yes, Roman answered. Calder smirked and entered anyway. His gaze landed on me. Elliot. Calder, I said. Jacob stepped out from behind me. Calder's expression flickered. Not guilt, not shame, but irritation. Jacob, he said. Didn't expect to see you standing so tall. I'm done being manipulated, Jacob said quietly. Calder's smile tightened. Who says I manipulated you? Truth can feel manipulative if you don't like the sound of it. Roman stepped between him and Jacob. You're not here for conversation. Say what you came to say. Calder's eyes drifted to the binder on the table. I came, he said slowly, because you have something that belongs to me. You mean what you stole from dozens of people, I asked. What Vivian spent years trying to expose. His nostrils flared. She took what wasn't hers. She took what she needed to protect her family, I said. Calder's voice dropped, and now I need it back to fix what she broke. I opened the binder, exposing the rows of documents inside. You mean this? His jaw twitched. There are 3 copies, I said, and a digital upload that will hit a secure drive at midnight unless I personally cancel it. That got him. I watched the mask finally beautifully crack. You wouldn't dare, he hissed. Vivian dared when she hid the truth, I said. I'm just finishing what she started. Calder stepped forward, fury rising like a dark tide, but Roman intercepted him, gripping his arm. Try it, Roman said, and you'll leave in handcuffs. Calder yanked his arm free and looked between the 3 of us, angry, trapped, suddenly less powerful than he'd ever imagined. You're making a mistake, he whispered. No, I said. I'm ending one. I handed Roman the flash drive. Roman left the room for 30 seconds. When he returned, he nodded once. Upload confirmed. Firewall engaged. Calder's face drained of color. You'll regret this, he murmured. No, I said again, quieter. But you will. Calder looked at Jacob then, not with hatred but with loss. "You could have been mine," he said. Jacob lifted his chin. "I belong to the man who raised me." Calder stopped speaking, stopped threatening, stopped pretending. He walked out without another word, and when the sound of his engine faded into the night silence filled the house like a blessing. Jacob let out a breath he'd been holding for months. Roman sat heavily on the arm of the couch and rubbed his eyes. I closed the binder for the last time. The wind outside calmed. The lake smoothed. The house exhaled. And for the first time since Vivian died, I felt the walls around me soften not with fear, but with peace. Jacob hugged me. "Dad, is it over?" "Yes," I murmured. "It's over." Roman gave a quiet laugh. "Until the next battle in life," but even he sounded relieved. We spent the rest of the night in the living room, talking, finally, breathing, letting the long months of tension unwind. I told Jacob stories about Vivian he'd never heard. Roman shared the day Vivian asked him to guard our family. And Jacob told us he planned to move into a small apartment nearby, start fresh, rebuild. The sun was rising by the time we all felt steady again. The final lock clicked on the vault as I closed it, knowing I would rarely need it again. Not for secrets, but for memories. Vivian's voice echoed in my mind. "You're not alone." She had been right. I wasn't. Not then. Not now. Not ever again. And if you're still here with me at this point in the story, I hope you take one thing with you. No matter how dark the storm feels, there is always a way to protect what matters. Always a way to rise again. If this story moved you or reminded you of a time you had to fight for family, I'd love to hear it. Leave a comment. Share your thoughts. Stay with us for the next story, because there are more battles, more victories, and more voices like mine waiting to be heard. And I hope you'll be here for them.